basically kept interest rates low from 2003 through 2004 and then into 2005. And what that did was it created a bubble. That's happened a lot in the past. The Federal Reserve will keep money too loose, too low, too cheap. We've had dot-com bubbles, we had commodity bubbles, with gas prices. We got this time a housing bubble. What that means is housing prices started shooting up. They're going up in unsustainable double-digit increases every year for about 3 years. And so the market saw this and said, wow, a lot of money can be made in the housing sector. And so what we had was, we had all these new mortgages being written that were written in a very shoddy way. The thinking was, it really doesn't matter if the person you're giving the mortgage to can pay it back or not, because the house will continue to rise in value. If they fall out of place, if they get foreclosed, can't make the payments, no big deal. Take the house over, sell it, make a profit. So basically what happened was all the underwriting criteria got loosened, relaxed. Subprime mortgages at that time were 6% of the mortgages. Now they're 40%. And so what happened over the course of the time was people were getting loans without putting any money down, no down payments. People were getting loans without having to prove their income or their net worth or their ability to pay it, and all these mortgages got written. And then Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, two federal government-sponsored enterprises, kind of blessed this process. What they did was, in many cases, they took these mortgages, bundled them in to a security and sold them on into the marketplace, putting their stamp of approval on it, and they bought tons of these subprime mortgages themselves, putting, yet again, the government stamp of approval on these things, making these securities seem safer than they otherwise were, and move them on into the system. What I mean when I say move them on into the system, brought them through our financial system, which I would say is, it has outdated, opaque regulations. We basically had a 20th century regulatory system on our financial markets during the 21st century when you had all these high-risk, very complicated instruments, investment vehicles. And so you had Wall Street looking at this situation saying, you know what, we can make a lot of money on these things, on these securities. So they took these securities, packaged them together, and sold them off into the marketplace and made a really good commission on it and bore none of the risk. And so what ended up happening is what I call, you had a system of crony capitalism occur, where the government promotes these kinds of mortgages, promotes either through the lack of proper regulation or just outright promotion, the decoupling of risk from the investment. That's very dangerous. When someone makes an investment, you want that person to still bear some of the risk of that investment so they, make a prudent investment, so they have some skin in the game. What happened here was the risk was severed from the investment. You had these securities designed, sold off, and some poor schmuck down the road gets stuck with the risk, and the people selling these things are just making really good commissions, and it just kind of went off. And so we had all these financial institutions worldwide, banks, insurance companies, investment banks, got all these things on their books, these assets, these mortgage-backed securities. What happens eventually with any bubble? Well, the bubble burst. So what happened was housing prices started dropping, foreclosures started going, and all of these securities were based upon the premise that housing prices will continue to rise, foreclosure rates will be what they always have been, sort of the average rate, and that world just turned upside down. And so the value of these securities just started plummeting. And no one really knew what they were worth. No one really knew how bad a bank or a financial institution was, how much they had on their books. They were so complicated, it was difficult to untangle this mess. And then come October, we had a good old-fashioned financial panic. And we had a total credit crunch. And what I mean, and that's basically what got us into this recession. What I mean when I say credit crunch is, credit is really the lifeblood of an economy. It's the circulatory system of our economy. Credit is the ability of a business person, a nursery. I actually talked to a landscaper on Monday who, can't get money from his bank to finance the purchase of his inventory, his trees, his shrubs, his mulch, his stuff, to finance his spring, landscaping season, his summer landscaping season. It's the ability for businesses to finance inventory, payroll, people to go out and get money to buy cars, to buy homes, for students to go get money for mortgages, for student loans. It's the ability of money to go move through the economy basically stopped. And what ended up happening was all these mortgage-backed securities were considered toxic assets that completely clogged up the system. And that is what led to this. Basically, our economy went off a cliff. These bars just show you the quarters, every quarter's growth rate in our economy during the last decade, the 2000s. That's the early part of the decade where we had a very mild recession. We basically went down 6.3% in the last quarter of last year, meaning we really went off a cliff. This quarter, they're suggesting it's going to be somewhere around here, between 5 and 6%. It's the worst recession we've seen since the 40s. It's a global recession as well. So, what's the government doing? The government has basically done three things. And I'll get through this and then we'll start talking. Number one, the Troubled Asset Relief Program. This is an old PowerPoint, isn't it? The Troubled Asset Relief Program. That's the TARP. You heard about TARP? TARP is kind of a new acronym that we use. This was when that whole October crisis occurred, when it looked like we were going to have an absolute crash on our hands. Treasury said we need the authority to go out and get these toxic assets, to get these toxic assets off of the balance sheets of these banks, bring them over to the sidelines so that credit can start flowing again and the economy can recover. That was the plan. Deal with the things that were crashing the economy. Well, a month or two after this bill passed, the Treasury Secretary at the time, it was Bush's secretary, a guy named Paulson, basically said, you know what, that's just going to take too long to figure out, it's too complicated, we're just going to give the banks a bunch of money instead. That was not the intention of Congress. That was not the plan, the original TARP plan to begin with. And so what he basically did was he just gave banks money in exchange for equity stock. So the government was just buying huge shares of these private banks and other kinds of corporations like insurance companies. And the hope was that that money would just sort of flush the system through, that that money would unlock capital and credit would start flowing again. Well, you think it's worked? No. Hasn't worked. I mean, it did stop a crash from just plummeting, but it hasn't worked. And so what now Treasury is saying is, you know what, we probably need to go back to plan A, which is we got to go deal with these toxic assets that are still sticking the process up, holding things back. And so now, just this week, they're trying to implement this new plan to go deal with these toxic assets. Well, let's look at what else the government has done. The Federal Reserve.